is Excel for Beginners, the complete course. It doesn't matter how little experience you have in Excel. I promise you that as you watch this video and follow along, that you will learn everything you need to know to get started using Excel effectively. Don't be intimidated by Excel. You can do it. And regardless of what version of Excel you're using, this video is what you need to get started using Excel. In this first section, we're going to look at how to create workbooks in Excel and how to save them. And also we'll learn the basics of what I call the anatomy of a spreadsheet and also the layout in Microsoft Excel. Let's get started. So whenever you start up Excel, it should take you first to a screen similar to this one. You may see a list of recently used spreadsheets, but you'll also have a way to create a new blank workbook. And I'm going to click here just to show that there will often also be templates that you can click to open up and use. You can also search, and there's a button here to more templates. But I'm just going to click blank workbook to open up a brand new, completely blank workbook in Microsoft Excel. And before we create anything in this workbook, let's talk about the anatomy of a spreadsheet. When you're working in Microsoft Excel, you will always have at least one sheet. You can see here in the lower left it says sheet 1, but it's possible to have multiple sheets. And all of those sheets collectively together are called a workbook. Right now, my workbook just has the one spreadsheet. In Excel, spreadsheets are made up of columns. You can see this is column E, this is column C, this is column K. And when I select the letter for that column, the entire column gets selected. We also have rows in Excel. This is row 3, this is row 9, this is row 10. So every column has a column letter and every row has a row number. Now, the intersection of a column and a row is what we call a cell. So, for example, this cell here is the intersection of column E and row 10. And an Excel workbook can contain over 17 billion cells. When you click on a cell, that becomes the active cell. Now, one of the most powerful things about the cells in Excel is that each one can be described by the intersection of its column and row. So, for example, this is cell F8, and that's how you say it, F8. What cell is this? This is cell L4, and this is cell B7. Now, because of this fact that you can describe every single cell in Microsoft Excel, there's a lot of exciting possibilities that come about because of that, and you'll see that as you begin using Excel more. The next part of the anatomy of a spreadsheet is range. A range is a collection of cells that are generally grouped together. So I've clicked and dragged to select a group of cells in Excel. This is a range. And we can also describe every range in Microsoft Excel, once again using the column letters and the row numbers. The way you do this is you start in the upper left corner of the range and you describe that cell. So D4 through, and then you go to the lower right corner and describe that cell, J14. So the description of this range, its reference basically, is D4 through J14. And in Excel, the way you indicate through is with a colon. So D4 through J14. This is very important and will become more and more useful and important as you keep using Excel. So that is the anatomy of a spreadsheet. We have columns, we have rows, we have cells. The cell that you've selected is the active cell, and we have ranges. And all of this is done on a sheet or spreadsheet, or it's also called worksheet. You can add more worksheets by clicking this plus sign. Now I have 2 sheets, now I have 3 sheets, and the collection of all of these sheets together is what we call a workbook. Now, in addition to the anatomy of the spreadsheet, it's also important to understand the layout that we have to work with in Microsoft Excel. As you use Excel, you'll notice that there are tabs across the top of the screen. Generally, you'll start on the Home tab, but we also have the Insert tab, Page Layout tab, Data tab, etc. Whenever you click a tab, the tool buttons that you have here below change, and this part of the layout is called the ribbon. So if I click the Formulas tab, I get the Formulas ribbon. If I click the View tab, the ribbon completely changes. Now I have the View ribbon. And each ribbon is divided up into groups. You can see the groups are separated by lines. So I have a Charts group, I have a Tours group, a Comments group, a Tables group, etc. Now, not all of the options can fit in such a small group. For example, my charts group is not big enough to hold all of the options. So some of the groups have what I call a launch button, or sometimes it's called a dialog launcher, but I'll just call it a launch button. Not all of the groups have these launch buttons, but if you click on a launch button, it'll open up with even more options than could normally fit in the space provided on the ribbon. In addition to the tabs, the ribbons, and the groups, and the launch buttons, we also have some other layout features that you really need to know. Over here on the right, we have a scroll bar that you can use to move down your spreadsheet and up the spreadsheet. We also have a horizontal scroll bar. Underneath that, we have a zoom slider. If I slide this to the right, I zoom in on the spreadsheet. If I slide it to the left, I zoom out on the spreadsheet. Doing this does not change the data at all. It just zooms in or out. I have some view buttons here in the lower right corner. I can go to page break preview or the page layout view, but most Excel users spend most of their time in normal view. Here in the upper left, we have what's called the name box. Whenever you click on a cell, you can look in the name box to see the description of that cell or the name for that cell. And later you'll learn that this name box can do even more for you. Here at the top of my Excel layout, I have the quick access toolbar, and I have customized this. Yours may look different, but this gives me quick access to some of the most commonly used features in Microsoft Excel: my save button, an undo button, auto sum, and more. Here's my title for this spreadsheet. Over here I have my close button. It looks like an X. If I click that, the spreadsheet will close. And then finally here I have a very special bar called the formula bar. In many cases, this is where you'll go to enter formulas into Microsoft Excel. So now that you know about the anatomy of a spreadsheet and also the layout in Microsoft Excel, you are completely ready to begin learning to use Excel. At this point, I'm going to click File and Save. But because this is my first time saving this document, it's having me do a Save As. I need to decide where to save this Excel workbook. So I'm going to click on Browse, and I'm just going to save it in My Documents. And I'll just write a name for it: Excel for Beginners, Complete Course, and Save. It's time now for the second segment of this course, which is how to enter cell values in Microsoft Excel. And let's say I work for a small business and I've been asked to create a payroll spreadsheet for the employees. Here in column A, I'd like to have the employee ID numbers. In column B, the employee names, and then some information about their wages, the hours worked, how much they are owed, etc. And anytime in Excel, when you want to enter data into a cell, it's important to first select that cell. There's a saying that I heard once that I use over and over, which is select to affect. If I want to affect this spreadsheet, if I want to affect the data in the spreadsheet, first I have to select something. So I want to affect A1, so I'll select it. Just by clicking on it once, I can now affect it by typing. So let's say the employee ID number for employee 1 is simply 1. I type the number 1 and that data appears in the cell, but it's not truly entered in the cell until I tap Enter or Return on the keyboard. Now the data is inside that cell. Notice when I tapped Enter, the active cell moved down 1, and that's great because that's where I want to type the next number: 2. Enter, 3, enter, 4, enter. And I could just continue to do this down the spreadsheet. But that is kind of a repetitive task, and Excel has a built-in feature to make it so it's not so repetitive. There's something called the fill handle, or the autofill handle in Microsoft Excel. And the way it works is that it's been set up to identify patterns, and then to extend those patterns. So I want to show Excel the pattern that is developing here. The pattern is adding 1 to the previous number. So 1, 2, 3, 4. The pattern is clear. I'm just adding 1. So if I click and drag to select that range, A1 through A4, the pattern should be clear. Now I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see this a little better. But if you look in the lower right corner of this range that I've selected, you'll see a little green square. That's what we call the autofill handle or the fill handle. If I put my mouse pointer directly on that little green square, notice that the mouse pointer becomes a black plus sign. Now if I click and hold the click, I can drag down the spreadsheet. I'm going to go all the way to 70, and then I can release the mouse button, and look what it does. Excel automatically extended the pattern that I showed it. Next, I'm going to click on cell B1 because I want to affect that cell. And I'll type the name of the first employee. And then I'll tap enter. And again, the active cell moves down the spreadsheet. I can type the next employee name, and I'm just going to use first names so that this goes faster, and the third name. Now you'll notice I misspelled one of the names. This is supposed to be James, not Jams. So this gives me the opportunity to teach you a very important concept in Microsoft Excel, and that is the difference between clicking on a cell and clicking in a cell. When you click on a cell once, the whole cell is selected. So if I click on Jams and I try to fix this so that it says James, the first letter I type will erase whatever the contents of that cell already is. So that's what happens when you click on a cell and type. It erases everything that's already there. Well, what if I've got 5 or 6 words in this cell and only one word is misspelled? I don't want to have to retype all of it. So instead of clicking on the cell, I'm going to double click on the cell, and that gets me inside the cell. Now you can see my flashing cursor, and I can use the arrow keys to move that cursor to exactly the right place, and then I can type and fix the misspelled word. Then I can tap enter on the keyboard, and that correction is entered into the cell. Now as you're entering data into Excel, every time you tap enter, the active cell should move down. But what if you need to move up? You can hold the shift key and tap enter, and that should move you up the spreadsheet. Give me a few seconds to finish entering names, and then I'll resume. Now that I've finished my list of names, I'm going to click here on cell B1 because I need to show you, in addition to moving down the spreadsheet by tapping enter and up the spreadsheet by using shift enter, you can move right and left by using the tab key. So if I tap tab, I move to the right. Now I'm on cell C1 and I can type in the hourly wage of Julia. If I need to move to the left, you can probably guess what keys I need to press. Shift tab moves me to the left. So enter is down, shift enter is up, tab is to the right, shift tab is to the left. So I'm going to tab over to cell D1 and I'll put in the number of hours Julia has worked in this month, 160. I'll tab over. The next thing we need to learn about entering cell values in Excel is how to clear and copy cell contents. So we've already looked at how to edit them by double-clicking, but what if you just need to copy the contents of one cell to another cell? You can click on a cell, or even a range if you prefer, and then hold the Control key and tap C to copy. Now there are other ways to do this. You could go to the Home tab, and you could click this button here to copy the contents of cell C1 in this case. It's also possible to right-click, copy, but in most cases, simply using Control C to copy and Control V to paste is going to be your fastest way to copy paste. So I could just keep pasting in the number 15 in each of these cells, but remember we have a tool called the autofill handle, and it's great to avoid the repetitive entering of data. So now, with just cell C5 selected, what is the pattern that the autofill handle is going to see? The only pattern I'm showing it is one number. If I click on the autofill handle and pull down the spreadsheet all the way down to the bottom, it's going to extend that pattern of just the number 15, and it basically copies that same number all the way down the page. So that's a shortcut that we can use. But what if this number isn't accurate for all of these employees? Maybe Amelia is making more than $15 an hour. I could click on that cell and just overwrite it with another number, tap enter, and that's a very fast way to do it. But there are times when you need to not only delete the information that's there by either overwriting it or tapping the delete key or backspace key on the keyboard, but sometimes you need to completely clear everything that's in that cell. Not just the data, but maybe also the formatting and other information. You can do that a couple of different ways. One is to right-click on the cell and choose Clear Contents, but one of my favorite ways is to select the cell or range of cells, and then go up here to the Home tab. On the Home ribbon in the Editing group, we have this button. And if you click the arrow next to the button, you can clear all, or just clear the formats, contents, hyperlinks, etc. I'll click Clear All, and everything is completely wiped clean out of that range. I'll hold Control and tap Z to undo that, but it's important that you know about that feature. Now, as I'm building this spreadsheet, I'm realizing it's going to be hard for me to remember exactly what each of these columns of data represents. 15 what? 16 what? 160 what? I should have put in column titles or headings. So let's look at how to insert new rows and columns into Excel. If I need another blank row above row number 1, what can I do? Well, all I have to do is right-click on the number 1 and choose Insert. If I need a new blank column, all I need to do is right-click on, let's say, column A and choose Insert, and I get a column to the left of column A. I can also insert columns in between data, so I'll right-click on D, Insert, now I get a blank column between C and now E, and I could do the same with rows. I'm going to undo all of that to get back to this point where I just have a new blank row above my data. And I'll click here on cell A1 and I'll call this Employee ID. I'll use Tab to move over to cell B1 and I'll type Name. I'll use Tab to go over to C1 and I'll type Hourly Wage. And I'll tap Tab to move over to D1 and I'll type Hours Worked. I'll tab over to E1 and type Taxable Income. At this point, I'll tap Enter on the keyboard. Now I understand a lot better what all of the data in these columns is about. Now you probably noticed that not all of my data in row number 1 actually fits inside the columns. For example, in C1, hourly wage doesn't really fit in the space I have provided for it. So let's look at how to fix that. I could click and hold the click between the letter C and the letter D, column C and D. And then I could drag that column to make it so the text fits. And I could do the same with column A, column D, column E. But let me show you a faster way. If I click and drag across from A all the way to E, actually clicking on the column letters, and then if I double click between any two of these column letters, let's say between B and C, I'll double click. What happens is all of the columns are resized to the perfect width so that the data that's inside those columns will fit. That looks a lot better. Now, as I'm entering data in Excel, from time to time, I may need a little help with that. For example, let's say that the standard hourly wage increases from $15 an hour to $15.50 an hour. How could I quickly update all of this information? One way to do that would be to use Find and Replace. So here in Excel, if I go to the Home tab on the Home ribbon, in the Editing group, you'll find and Select. You may see the text or you may just have a magnifying glass. If you click on the arrow next to that, notice that there's an option for Find and there's also Replace. I'm going to select Replace, and this lets me find what, let's say 15, and replace it with 15.5. And I'll select Replace All. All done, we made 70 replacements. I click OK and close. You'll notice that all of the 15s have been turned into 15.5. Now there is one problem with that. Notice employee ID number 15, and so I can just update that manually. So that is a great time saver. If you want to keep your hands on the keyboard more, instead of using the mouse to go over here and click on Find and Replace, you could hold Control on the keyboard and tap H, and that brings up the Find and Replace option. Generally speaking, anytime you can keep your hands on the keyboard and not use the mouse, you'll be able to work more efficiently in Excel. One other trick for entering cell values and data into Microsoft Excel that you'll definitely want to know is how to use the autocorrect features. So if I go here to File and choose More, I can go to Options, and here in my Excel options, I could go down here to Proofing, and here you'll see autocorrect options. Change how Excel corrects and formats text as you type. If I click this button, it lets me adjust some of these settings. So for example, right now, if I type a day, it will automatically capitalize the first letter of that day. And there's some other settings here that you can change. But down here, you'll notice that there's a replace blank with blank. And there's already some examples here of common misspelled words and how they'll be automatically corrected. So let's say I need to type the name of my YouTube channel quite often. Instead of typing the beautiful name Technology for Teachers and Students over and over and over, what I could do is I could just type T4TAS, and then I'll tab over, and this will make it so that I can type T4TAS, and it will automatically be replaced with the most descriptive and catchy name in the history of YouTube channels. I'll click Add, click OK. Let's try it out. I'll click OK again. So now if I click on a cell and type T4TAS, tap Enter, it's automatically auto-corrected to be the full name of my YouTube channel. I'm going to undo that. But definitely think about the autocorrect features in Microsoft Excel and adjust them to your advantage. I've now updated some of these hourly wages and I've put in all of the hours worked for each employee. One last thing I want to show you about entering values and managing the data that you put into Excel is I want to show you how to move the contents of cells. We've already looked at how to copy-paste by clicking on a cell or range, Control-C to copy, Control-V to paste. You could also do a cut-paste, Control-X to cut, Control-V to paste, and that essentially moves the data from one cell to another. But another way to do the same thing is just to click on a cell and then put your mouse on the very edge of that cell, any of the edges. You'll see that the mouse pointer becomes a cross with arrows coming out the ends. At that point, you can click and hold the click and then drag the contents of that cell anywhere you want it to go and then release the mouse button. I'm going to undo that with Control-Z. I just want you to see that you can do the same thing with a range. Now that I've selected the range, I go to the very edge of that range, click and hold the click, and then drag the data where I want it to be, release the mouse button, and the data has been moved. Again, Control-Z to put it back. With that, we're now ready for the third segment of Excel for Beginners, Complete Course. In this segment, we're going to focus on formulas. I would like to calculate the total taxable income for each employee. And for that, I need to multiply each employee's wage by how many hours they worked. So I could do that in my head, or I could use the calculator and then just put in the information here. But that is exactly one of the things that Excel does best. Excel is a spreadsheet tool, yes, but it's also a calculator. It has built in pretty much all of the calculator functions and operators that you would need. So here on cell E2, I'm going to create my first formula. In Excel, whenever you're creating a formula, you need to start by typing equals. When I first started using Excel, this was confusing to me until I thought about algebra. In my Algebra 1 class that I took, I remember learning about variables. And there would be formulas like x equals, and then it would be y plus 10 divided by 3 or whatever. That's basically what we're doing here. So whenever I type equals, before I type it, I think E2, and then I type equals. So cell E2 equals whatever comes next. And here I could just type in 13.9, and then I could put in multiplied by, or times. And in Excel, we use an asterisk for multiply. So 13.9 multiplied by 158. And then I can type enter on the keyboard, and that is the taxable income for Julia. So that's one way to do a formula in Excel. You can type in the numbers, you can use plus signs, minus signs, asterisks for multiply, forward slash for divide, and then just tap enter, and that formula will be executed. But there's another way to do the same thing, and it's a better way. Again, I need to start by clicking on the cell and then typing equals. But this time, instead of typing in the numbers, I'm going to type in the cell references. If you remember, in Excel, we can describe every cell in this spreadsheet. We can name it, basically. And remember, we do have this name box in the upper left corner to help us with that. So equals, and I'm going to name or describe this cell. So that would be C2. So I'll just type in C2 asterisk for multiplied by D2. And I'll type in D2. Now you'll notice as I typed in those cell references, Excel highlighted them in different colors. So I can see exactly what I'm about to do. Now I'll tap enter on the keyboard and I get the same result, but this time it's a little better. The reason why it's better is because this formula now is dynamic. If I change the contents of one of these cells, let's say it's a mistake, Julia doesn't really have a wage of 13.9, it's more like 14.25. I can tap enter and look at the taxable income, it's going to change. So this is a superior way to create a formula in Excel. There is one other method that I want you to be aware of. I could type equals, and then instead of typing the cell references, C3 asterisk D3, I could just click on the cell. So C3 asterisk, and then click on D3. Tap enter, and my formula produces results. Now it looks like the contents of cell E2 and cell E3 are simple numbers. It looks like the contents of E2 is 2,251.5 and the contents of E3, 2,480. But that's not actually true. If I double click on E2, you can see that the contents of that cell is just a formula. What about E3? Double click, the contents of that cell is a formula. So we see the results of the formula, but what actually is in the cell is a formula. And let's talk about the type of formula that we have. In both cases, these are relative cell references. What that means is, when I say C3 multiplied by D3, what Excel is interpreting that as being is just to multiply whatever is in two cells to the left multiply that by whatever is in one cell to the left. So watch what happens now when I use the autofill handle. If you remember, the autofill handle lets me extend a pattern. If there is no pattern, what it does is it copies the contents of a cell. So I'm going to use the autofill handle, and I could click and drag all the way down the spreadsheet like I have in the past, but I want you to see a shortcut. If you have a table basically of data that's all together, instead of clicking and dragging on the autofill handle, it is faster just to double click on the autofill handle and it automatically extends down the page. So look at that. Because I use the autofill handle, I don't have to keep creating formula after formula after formula. My formula was copied and extended down the spreadsheet because I used the autofill handle. Now, how come that worked? The reason it worked is because of what I said a minute ago. Excel is interpreting these cell references as being relative, not absolute. So C3, Excel just interprets that as 2 cells to the left. D3, 1 cell to the left. Multiply the two together, you get a result. So down here, when I copied that formula down using the autofill handle, it just adjusted those cell references. It's still 2 cells to the left multiplied by 1 cell to the left. It's no longer bothering with C3 and D3. It's moved on to C4 times D4. What about down here? Double click, C7 multiplied by D7. The reason this works is because these are relative cell references. Now, what if I wanted to calculate the amount of taxes to be paid? Now, I understand this isn't how it's normally done, but let's pretend. And let's say the tax rate is 7%. And I'm going to enter this as a decimal, 0.07, and I tap enter. Let's use a formula now to calculate the taxes to be paid. I'll click here on cell F2, and in my head, I'll say to myself, cell F2, and then I type equals the taxable income of Julia in this case, multiplied by the tax rate, H1. I'll tap enter on the keyboard and you can see the results. This worked beautifully. But what happens when I use the autofill handle and double click to extend that down the page? It didn't work. Why didn't it work? Let's look at these formulas. Because I used relative cell references here in my original formula, Excel is looking 1 cell to the left and multiplying it by 2 cells to the right and 1 above. So when I copied that formula down the spreadsheet, it continued that pattern. It's looking 1 cell to the left, 2 cells to the right, and 1 up. And because these cells are empty, it's like multiplying by 0. So I'm going to fix this formula by clicking on cell F2. And in Excel, anytime I want to extend a formula, work on a formula, what I like to do is click on a cell, and then instead of editing it here by double-clicking on it and making some changes, it's easier and better in most cases to just select the cell and then go up here to what's called the formula bar. This is a safer, easier, better place to edit and work with your Excel formulas. So right now, these are relative cell references. I want to change the H1 reference to become an absolute cell reference. The way I do that is by putting a $sign in front of the H and a $sign in front of the 1, and then tap enter on the keyboard. And what those $signs do is they force Excel, whenever this formula is copied or used, to always refer exactly to column H and to row 1. So that part of the formula, no matter how far down the spreadsheet I copy it, it will remain fixed on cell H1. Let's try it now. I'll double click on the autofill handle. It copies down the page. Let's see if it's working. It looks like it is. If I double click on any of these formulas, you can see they're all referring back to cell H1, and that's where the tax rate is kept. So that's a very important concept to understand, the difference between relative cell references like this one and absolute cell references like this one. And cell references could be partially relative and partially absolute. I could have left the $sign off the H and just kept the $sign on the 1.